Em nome de Alá, o Misericordioso, o Misericordiador.
أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون.
Se houvéssemos feito descer este Alcorão sobre uma montanha, vê-la-ias humilde, rachada, por receio de Alá. E estes exemplos propomos-los para os homens, a fim de refletirem.
هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم.
Ele é Alá. Não existe Deus senão Ele, o sabedor do invisível e do visível. Ele é o misericordioso, o misericordiador.
هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون.
Ele é Alá. Não existe Deus senão Ele, o Rei, o puro, a paz, o confortador, o predominante, o todo-poderoso, o transcendente, o orgulhoso. Glorificado seja lá acima do que idolatram.
هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم.
Ele é Alá, o Criador, o iniciador da criação, o configurador. Dele são os mais belos nomes. O que há nos céus e o que há na terra glorifica-o. Ele é o Todo-Poderoso, o Sábio.
Physics is a Greek word meaning the science of change. And for the classical Greek tradition, there was a strong sense in which the science of change was in contradiction with mathematics. Mathematics dealt with perfect knowledge, with the unchanging world of mathematical forms. And it seemed in principle extremely unlikely that processes of coming into being and passing away, of growth and of decay, of qualitative change, could be captured with the beauties of geometry and mathematics.
The story of how humanity shook off this idea and began to see that mathematics is actually an incredibly powerful way of describing the world around us is long and complicated. But for me, Islamic scientists played a crucial role, and I believe one man really led this movement to turn mathematics from a language of abstract thought into a truly practical science. And his name was Ibn al-Haytham.
What al-Haytham and his contemporaries argued for was the possibility, in a way, of a single science, which would be both mathematical and philosophical, which would link together a physics, a science of change, with a mathematics, a science of quantity. And that seems to me to be radical and crucial for the construction of new forms of reliable knowledge.
Ibn al-Haytham carried out a series of experiments that created the modern science of optics. Aristotle argued that when we look at, say, a tree, its essence or form emanates from it, and then mysteriously flows into our eyes.
So if I'm, for instance, now looking at the buildings and the trees on the banks of the Nile, I'm receiving the forms of these buildings and these trees in the eye, abstracted from their matter.
Ibn al-Haytham found this idea deeply unsatisfactory. He wanted a mathematical explanation. And looking back at existing Greek writings, he found one, although it was obscure and bizarre. This idea claimed that we see because light rays come out of the eye.
Ultimately, it says that vision occurs by way of the emission from the eye of light that is shaped in the form of a pyramid or a cone.
This cone-shaped beam illuminates what we're looking at and is defined by nice geometric straight lines. It seems Ibn al-Haytham liked this mathematical approach, but immediately spotted its flaws. If we see, he asked, because light comes out of the eye, why does it hurt when you look at a bright object like the sun, but not hurt when you look at something dim? Or at night, can light from our eyes really be lighting up distant objects in the sky? So, in an inspired piece of thinking, Ibn al-Haytham combined the two Greek ideas and defined our modern understanding of light and vision. Light, he said, does travel in straight lines that obey geometric laws, but instead of them coming out of the eye, these rays travel into it.
It is the development of an entirely new theory, and also methodologically, it is the beginnings of mathematizing physics.
In about 1020, Ibn al-Haytham published his groundbreaking geometric explanation of light in his Kitab al-Manadhir, or Book of Optics. And what really marks this book out as science is that Ibn al-Haytham carefully justifies his theories with detailed experiments that others can repeat and verify. He starts from first principles to find out how light travels. For his first experiment, Ibn al-Haytham wanted to test the idea that light travels in straight lines. Now, to do this, he took a straight tube on which he'd drawn a straight line down the side and a ruler, again with a straight line down the length of it. And by matching the two together, he was convinced then that the tube was straight. Now, if he uses it to look at an object, in this case a candle, he can see the candle through the tube, which is good evidence that the light is travelling up in a straight line. But just to be sure, he then blocked the end of the tube. And then, by looking at the candle again, of course, he can't see it, because what this does is confirm that the light doesn't travel to his eye via any other route in a curved path outside the tube, proof that light only travels in a straight line. Then, through experiment, he extends his light travels in straight lines idea to many other phenomena. He explains how mirrors work by arguing that the angle the ray comes in at is the same as the angle it bounces off at. He explains what we now call refraction, why objects look kinked in a glass of water, arguing that light rays bend when they move from one medium to another. And then he tackles the nature of vision. Ibn al-Haytham wanted to understand how an object makes an image on the retina of the eye. So he built what he believed was a stripped-down version of the eye, which is basically a black box with a tiny hole in it. Now that I'm inside the camera obscura and I've allowed my eyes to get used to the dark, we can open the hole. And there we clearly see the image of Anna waving on the screen. But the image is inverted because light travels in straight lines, and so the light from her head has to move diagonally downwards to hit the bottom of the screen, and light from her feet travels diagonally upwards to hit the top. But more importantly, what this proved to Ibn al-Haytham is that there's a one-to-one correspondence between every point on the object, on Anna, and every point on her image on the screen. Just like a modern scientific paper, The attention to detail in the Kitab al-Manadhir is incredible. His book isn't just a dry scientific treatise, it's a manual for future generations. In his work, he constantly justifies his theories about light with experimental observation. And he describes his experiments in great detail so that other people can repeat them and confirm his ideas. His message is, don't take my word for it, see for yourself. What I find so impressive about Ibn al-Haytham is how once he arrives at his mathematical theories, he then uses them to extend our knowledge of the real world. So for instance, he used his new ideas about light to deduce that the Earth's atmosphere is of a finite thickness. And he even estimated what that thickness is. He did it basically by measuring how long twilight lasts. He rightly assumed that the reason it continues to be light after the sun has dropped below the horizon must be because its rays bend as they enter the Earth's atmosphere. The length of twilight and an educated guess for what we today call the air's refractive index gave Ibn al-Haytham a way of estimating the thickness of the Earth's atmosphere. He came up with a figure of around 40 kilometers, about half of the modern value. That's pretty impressive. It really shows how mathematics extends the power of science to explain. This is De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, which was published in 1543 by the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus.
Is it the second edition?
The significance of this book is enormous. In it, Copernicus argues for the first time since Greek antiquity that all the planets, including the Earth, go around the Sun. For thousands of years, everyone had believed a very different view, that the Earth is static and everything, including the stars, sun and planets, move around it.
And here there are all his system. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
And
Sol,
the system.
the sun in the
it's
middle.
It's a famous drawing.
Yes.
This one.
Oh yes, and there's Terra.
With the moon.
With the moon
with
going
the moon,
around it.
Okay. Yes.
This is an astonishing book, and many historians credit it with starting the European scientific revolution, the first crucial step in a journey that led to modern physics. But it does seem a bit odd that one doesn't hear much about where Copernicus got his ideas and information. The impression is that they came out of nowhere.
The beginning?
And the beginning is all in Arabic.
It certainly is a real revelation to me that he explicitly mentions a 9th century Muslim for providing him with a great deal of observational data, an astronomer who lived in Damascus called al-Battani.
And here he mentioned Hipparchus, Calippo, Ptolemy, and so on, and he started to mention what he called Macometus Aratensis, and means al-Battani.
Okay. And then the second book here.
And the second book is, we can look at the beginning in Latin.
I see, we can open it.
Copernicus, in fact, made extensive use of al-Battani's observations of the positions of planets, the sun, the moon and stars. He worked with Latin translations, similar to this one, of the Syrian astronomers' data.
So it has the Arabic.
Yes, all the Arabic
on one
treatise,
side,
yes, and then the Latin version.
That's convenient.
But he had the data, the observational data by al-Battani.
And Copernicus's book is full of clues that hint at other past sources. And though al-Battani is the only Islamic astronomer Copernicus actually names, recent detective work has uncovered clues that Copernicus based many of his ideas on the work of other Islamic scholars. The clearest example is Copernicus's use of a mathematical idea devised by the 13th century Islamic astronomer al-Tusi, called the Tusi couple. Further detective work also shows that Copernicus used mathematical ideas for planetary motion that are remarkably similar to ones developed by another Islamic astronomer, a 14th century Syrian called Ibn Shatir.
Copernicus, to me, I have no proof, I don't have a smoking gun, but to me it looked like, and again by analyzing his own works, it looks like he was working from diagrams. Somebody gave him a geometric diagram of what was done by Ibn Shatir to solve the problem of the moon, for example, to solve the problem of the upper planets, to solve the problem of the movement of Mercury. He had diagrams, and he was genius enough to be able to figure out from the diagrams what was the underlying theory behind those diagrams.
Marking time accurately is essential to Islam. The Quran requires the faithful to pray 5 times a day at 5 very precise times. At the exact moment of dawn, when the sun is overhead, in the afternoon, at sunset, and then again at the moment of nightfall. So for early Islam, an accurate sundial was an extremely important fixture in many mosques. And I began to understand why Copernicus was so impressed by the work of his Islamic predecessors. They really brought standards of accuracy and precision to astronomy that were unheard of before. They'd calculated the size of the Earth to within 1% and created trigonometric tables accurate to 3 decimal places. Born in 858 in southern Turkey, Al-Battani made accurate astronomical measurement a personal obsession. Over 40 years, from 877, Al-Battani's great project was to work out as accurately as possible the length of the year.
This is a copy of the original manuscript.
Okay.
So I'll show you the chapter at which he explained the length of the year. Okay? The chapter 27. So he first started here by citing the ancient values of the Egyptians and the Babylonians, right? And he gives the length of the year.
Their estimate of the year was 365 days, 6 hours, and just over 10 minutes. To improve on this, Al-Battani used his ingenuity and a device like this, an armillary sphere. He used it to measure how the length of shadows varied over the course of a year. With this information, he was able to work out the precise day on which it's both light and dark for exactly the same time, the so-called equinox. And he repeated his measurements over the course of 40 years. Now here's the clever bit. He examined a Greek text that was written 700 years earlier and discovered the precise day on which its author had also measured the equinox. He now had 2 vital pieces of data: the number of days between the 2 observations and the number of years. He divided the first number by the second to arrive at an astonishing result. A year is 365 days, 5 hours, 46 minutes, and 24 seconds.
And he didn't stop there.
He measured variations in the diameter of the sun to such accuracy that it led him to an astonishing conclusion. This distance, the furthest point the sun reaches from the Earth during the year, known as the apogee, actually changes from one year to another.
Also, his tables showing the position of the sun and the moon, which is what Copernicus refers to some 600 years later, set a new standard in precision and accuracy. So Al-Battani and his fellow Islamic astronomers were clearly good observers. But so what, you might ask? Well, the answer is that their observations began to suggest to them that the prevailing Greek theory that described how everything in the heavens revolved around the Earth had some serious flaws. This Greek tradition, which had been unquestioned for over 700 years, was based primarily on the work of one of the greatest astronomers of the ancient world.
Claudius Ptolemaeus, or Ptolemy, was a Greek astronomer based in Alexandria in the 2nd century AD. He wrote one of the greatest texts in astronomy, the Almagest, which was basically a distillation of all Greek knowledge on the celestial world. Ptolemy believed that the sun, the moon, the planets and the stars all sat on crystal spheres that rotated around the Earth. So the moon sits on the innermost sphere, followed by the sun and the planets, and finally a patchwork of stars on the outermost sphere. So we human beings sit at the very center of the universe, with the rest of the universe rotating around us.
But as Ptolemy himself realized, there's a problem with trying to describe the heavens as a place of mathematically idealized perfect spheres. And that is that the planets don't really play ball. As they move across the night sky, they change speed, appear to get bigger and smaller, and even go back on themselves. Ptolemy tried to explain this away by arguing that the planets sat on small spheres called epicycles, which rotated around a bigger sphere called a deferent. This explained why they might look as though they were changing size, and why they sometimes even change direction. Unfortunately, that still didn't fit all the facts. It didn't easily explain why the planets appear to speed up and slow down. So, rather desperately, Ptolemy fudged his model further by moving the Earth away from the centre of the deferent and having the deferent rotate around an arbitrary point in space, the equant. But now, the works of astronomers like El-Battani started to strain Ptolemy's ideas to breaking point. Their careful observations began to suggest that even with Ptolemy's unwieldy equants and deferents, the actual behaviour of the heavens didn't fit the data.
So what do you do if you were an astronomer living in Baghdad and you have all those results on your table? The very first requirement is to say, this Greek tradition is not as trustworthy as it is advertised to be. And now, of course, they begin to say, if the fundamental values of the astronomical tradition of the Greeks, which we could double check and we found them to be in error, what else is in error? They began to question now the more basic, foundational astronomical, cosmological foundations of the Greek tradition.
And question they did. What's absolutely striking about the writings of Islamic scholars by the 9th century is the increasing use of the word shukuk, which in English means doubts.
To doubt takes great courage and imagination. But if the great dialogue between Islamic and European astronomers shows anything, it's that doubt, or shukuk, is the engine that drives science forward.
One of the first great shukuk scientists was called Ibn al-Haytham. He was born in the Iraqi city of Basra in 965 AD and was among the first to argue passionately that scientific ideas are only valid if they're mathematically consistent and reflect reality. And when he applied his fierce, rigorous intelligence to Greek astronomy, he immediately spotted that there was a fundamental contradiction at its heart. On the one hand, Greek cosmology argued that everything in the heavens revolves around the Earth. On the other hand, Ptolemy, in his Almagest, argued that if you want to mathematically predict how the sun and planets move, you have to pretend that they go around an arbitrary point in space, the so-called equant. This is clearly a contradiction. The heavens can't both go around the Earth and not go around it at the same time. Ibn al-Haytham hated this nonsensical contradiction. In the early 11th century, he wrote a paper, Al-Shukuk ala Ptolemaios, or Doubts on Ptolemy. In it, he writes with barely contained frustration, Ptolemy assumes an arrangement that cannot exist.
Ibn al-Haytham says that is a total absurdity. We cannot accept that. And furthermore, he says, it's not a slip of a tongue Ptolemy knew that it was an absurdity, and he shows us where Ptolemy himself was embarrassed by having to introduce it. So he says there is a fundamental reasoning problem, meaning that the Greeks knew that Ptolemy knew that he was making a mistake, but he knew he couldn't do any better, and hence now the challenge is to do one notch better, and hence to be able to fix this. That, in my explanation, begins to be the program of research for all astronomers to come.
In order to achieve that project, you had to be convinced that it was possible to make high precision mathematical models of the way in which planets and stars move that would really capture how they are in the heavens.
The top of this mountain in northern Iran was the adopted home of the man who was the next of Copernicus's Islamic influences, Nasruddin al-Tusi. He would succeed in rewriting Ptolemy's theory, which would ultimately lead to the overthrow of the geocentric view of the universe, and so the birth of the modern scientific age. This is the remote castle of Alamut, al-Tusi's adopted home. For many years, it was the home of a Muslim sect called the Ismailis.
It's a lovely secluded spot, and it was the center of the Ismaili movement. It's not surprising that al-Tusi would find a home here. And it wasn't just him. Many other scholars were gathered here, and there seems to have been a library. It was a center for learning as well as a military stronghold.
And it was within these cramped conditions that al-Tusi started his masterwork of the Shukuk, or the doubts, the Tadhkirah. In it, he finds an answer to Ibn al-Haytham's first challenge: how to eliminate Ptolemy's equant. Instead of a sphere rotating around an arbitrary point in space, al-Tusi devised a series of two nested circles, which rotate around each other in such a way that they eliminate the equant. The nested circles became known as a Tusi couple. This is the mathematical system that finds its way into Copernicus's work some 300 years later. Having found a solution to the equant problem, al-Tusi now wanted to complete the task Ibn al-Haytham had started 200 years earlier, to find a consistent mathematical description of the movement of the celestial bodies. But to do that, he needed better data, which meant bigger and better equipment than he was ever going to find here at Alamut. And then something happened which changed al-Tusi's life forever. The Mongols. Streaming in from the east, an army of Mongols led by Haluga Khan marched into Iran, crushing everything before them. By 1255, they had reached the foothills of Alamut, intent on its destruction. Then, in a brilliant piece of diplomacy, al-Tusi managed to both save his own skin and satisfy his scientific ambition. He visited the Mongol leader and played on his deep astrological superstition. Convincing him he could tell the future if only he had new equipment, al-Tusi persuaded the Khan to make him his head scientist and to build him just a few hundred miles away, perched on a hilltop where the air was clear, the largest observatory the world had ever seen. This is all that remains of the Maraga Observatory. The main instrument is hidden under this protective dome. Al-Tusi's new astronomical centre was based around a single large building. Inside was an enormous metal arc, an armillary arm, 10 metres across. On its circumference were marked angles in degrees and minutes. The scientists would line up the celestial object under study with a central point on the arc, and then make a reading from the markings on the arc, giving them the definitive, accurate position of the object in the sky. The building was also surrounded by smaller astronomical equipment, libraries, offices and accommodation. The observatory even had its own dedicated mosque. As well as the Tusi couple, they invented other systems of planetary movement. And with these new systems, they were able to calculate mathematically consistent models for many of the celestial bodies. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the Sun and Moon.
Al-Tusi and the astronomers he brought together created what became known as the Maragha Revolution, which was a complete paradigm shift in astronomy, overthrowing the old Ptolemaic view.
What Islamic scholars and astronomers like Al-Tusi do is to organize and make sense of mathematical astronomy at a level of unprecedented accuracy, using instruments more precise than had been built before, over longer timescales, with predictions of the positions of planets and stars that no one had previously reached. That at Maragha or at Alamut, we see, I think, genuine revolutions in the level, scale, and intensity of mathematical astronomy.
As we've seen, many of the complex mathematical models Copernicus uses in his new heliocentric model, like the Tusi couple, are copied from Islamic astronomers. But more importantly, it's Copernicus's deep desire to bring mathematical consistency to cosmology that he really owes to his Islamic predecessors. Copernicus's ideas set in motion a train of scientific revelations that would eventually lead to Isaac Newton and the discovery of gravity. In Newton's hands, Ibn al-Haytham's dream of an astronomy with rigorous and coherent mathematics, which agrees with experimental observation, finally took place. Venice was founded on a swamp off the coast of Italy and felt itself separate from Europe and not bound by its laws and traditions. As Venetians traded more and more with their Muslim neighbours, the influence of Islam was more strongly felt. Arabic coffee culture became hugely popular, as did Islamic styles of architecture with their characteristic arches and decorations. And with the Arabic trade came the Arabic books. The great 9th century Arabic text on algebra appeared in Latin in the 12th century. The same century saw the arrival of Arabic astronomical tables. And in the 15th century, the famous Canon of Medicine was first published in the West. And this influx of learning seems to coincide with a great historical shift. The engine of science begins to move west, from the Islamic world to Europe. That's where the great breakthroughs from the 1500s would mainly take place. 800 years earlier, one reason for Islamic science's success had been the precision of the Arabic language. With over 70 different ways of writing its letters and many extra symbols to define pronunciation and meaning, it allowed scholars of many different lands to communicate in a single common language. Now, with the arrival of the printing press, scientific ideas should have been able to travel even more freely. In the West, books printed in Latin accelerated its scientific renaissance. But because of its symbols and extra letters, Arabic was much harder to set into type than Latin, and so a similar acceleration in the Islamic world failed to materialize.
I believe this rejection of the new technology, the printing press, marks the moment in history when Arabic science undergoes a seismic shift. Europe has embraced Greek and Arabic knowledge and the new technology, and Galileo and his ilk are poised at the cusp of the Renaissance.
This initial rejection of printing was one of the many reasons that caused science in the Islamic world to fall behind the West. It coincided with a host of global changes, all of which affected the way science developed. The first and most obvious reason for the slowdown in Islamic science is that the Islamic Empire itself falls into decline from the mid-1200s. One reason for this is that it's under attack from all sides. From the east are the Mongols.
In 1258, they invaded the capital Baghdad, and it's said that the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers ran black for days with the ink of the books they'd destroyed. But trouble was also brewing in the far west of the empire. Islamic Spain, already fragmented into separate city-states, now faced a new threat, a united and determined onslaught from the Christian north.
The Reconquest, as it was called, raged for hundreds of years, but culminated in the 15th century when Ferdinand II and Isabella led an army which forced the last of the Muslims in Granada to surrender in 1492.
The Christians were intent on removing every last vestige of Islamic civilization and culture from Spain. In 1499, they ordered the burning in this square in Granada of all Arabic texts from Granada's libraries, except for a small number of medical texts. Within about 100 years, every Muslim in Spain had either been put to the sword, burnt at the stake, or banished.
And Christians from the east of Europe were intent on reclaiming the Holy Land. The Crusades.
Bent on carving out a holy Christian Levant and claiming the holy city of Jerusalem, the Crusaders launched a massive attack on northern Syria. They quickly captured this castle and turned it into one of their strongholds. Then, with ruthless and missionary zeal, they marched on Jerusalem.
And as the empire fought with its neighbours, it collapsed into warring fiefdoms. The Mamluks, slaves who originally belonged to the state of Egypt, became its leaders. The Bourbon Almohads ruled Morocco and Spain in the 13th century, and the north of Syria and Iraq splintered into a series of city-states. But for many historians of science, the biggest single reason for the decline in Islamic science was a rather famous event that took place in 1492. That year, the entire political geography of the world changed dramatically when a certain Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas.
I explain it with the phenomena of the discovery of the New World in 1492. The immediate result is that you got immense amount of gold and silver coming to the royal houses of Europe at the time, and all the adventurous empires and royal houses of the time who were setting colonies all over the world.
By the 17th century, England, sitting at the centre of the lucrative Atlantic trade route, could afford big science. And that ultimately explains why the greatest book in world science, Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, the book that ultimately explains the motion of the sun, the moon, and the planets, was not published in Baghdad, but in London.
It was necessary for him to have data of astonishing accuracy gathered from across the world. Global inventories of numbers, observations, positions. The heights of tides, the positions of comets and planets, the rate at which pendulums beat. It's a global project. It's big science. And many of those observations, many of those mathematical models were, of course, models initially developed by Islamic astronomers in Egypt and the Near East and Central Asia. One of the most fascinating developments, I think, in the history of the encounter between Western Europeans and other cultures is a kind of shift which has got fundamental and terrible consequences amongst Western Europeans when they start to reflect on why they are superior. It doesn't often cross Western Europeans' minds that they might not be superior to everybody else. For a very long time, after all, Western Europeans in general, the British for example, supposed that their superiority lay in their religion. But then I think around the 1700s, we begin to see a shift. And the shift is from claiming that the reason for European superiority is its religion to the reason for European superiority is its science and technology. Eventually it ends up with the famous phrase, we have the Gatling gun and they do not.
The Islamic part and the Arab part have not yet discovered their history because their history was obliterated intentionally by the colonization period. And unfortunately, when they rediscover it now, they're rediscovering it in bits and pieces.
Now, in the 21st century, there are many examples of cutting-edge research being carried out.
Well, I've arrived at the Royan Institute here in Tehran, where they carry out stem cell research, infertility treatment, and cloning research.
I was surprised to learn that here in Iran, an Islamic state, potentially controversial science like genetic modification and cloning is condoned, even funded by a theocratic government.
One of the uses is when a small part of the heart stops working, which is finally going to lead to heart failure.
Right.
So the cells from that part of the heart are actually replaced with the cells that have been cloned. Another use of cloning in therapeutics is actually creating an animal which has the medicine in their milk, for example. So when we drink the milk, we actually receive the medicine we need.
Considering genetic research has many vociferous opponents in Christian communities, I was intrigued to see that here in Tehran, they have their own in-house imam to offer support and advice on this sometimes quite controversial research.
We have got this medical ethic committee here in Royan Institute, and every project which is proposed is investigated in this committee, and we see different aspects of it, and they have got to justify the project for us.
I'm not enough of an expert in genetics to truly assess the quality of the work here, but one thing I can say is how at home I felt. Whatever cultural and political differences we have with the Iranian state, inside the walls of the lab, it was remarkably easy to find common ground with fellow scientists. Nature's rules are refreshingly free of human prejudice. That's something the scientists of the medieval Islamic world understood and articulated so well. In the 9th century, Al-Khwarizmi synthesized Greek and Indian ideas to create a new kind of mathematics, algebra. The polymath Ibn Sina brought together the world's traditions of healthcare into one book, contributing to the creation of the subject of medicine. In remote Iranian mountains, astronomers like Al-Tusi paved the way for scientists working hundreds of years later in Western Europe. These scientists' quest for truth, wherever it came from, was summed up by the 9th century philosopher Al-Kindi, who said, "It is fitting for us not to be ashamed of acknowledging truth and to assimilate it from whatever source it comes to us. There is nothing of higher value than truth itself. It never cheapens or abases he who seeks."
One moral emerges from this epic tale of the rise and fall of science in the Islamic world between the 9th and 15th centuries. And that is that science is the universal language of the human race. Decimal numbers are just as useful in India as they are in Spain. Star charts drawn up in Iran speak volumes to astronomers in Northern Europe. And Newton's Principia is just as true in Arabic as it is in Latin or English. What medieval Islamic scientists realized and articulated so brilliantly is that science is the common language of the human race. Man-made laws may vary from place to place, but nature's laws are true for all of us.